In this episode, we're going to talk about a training accident that ended in a crash, destroyed a flying career, and the student being awarded nearly $800,000 in damages, despite all the usual paperwork you'd expect in a flight school. But what about signing an indemnity form, you ask? Well, I'm going to touch on all that as well. All that and more coming right up. So strap in and let's get into it.
Good morning, 3614, Alpha Mallow 7 PB with Alpha.
Coordinating, Halen, I'm running bank power, bank pressure rolling to 30 degrees. That's 30 degrees there. Sit by star 9000, 1013, Kevlar 25.
G'day folks, and welcome to episode 194 of the Flight Training Australia podcast. The podcast all about flight training and flying in Australia and beyond. G'day, I'm your host Trent Robinson, and thank you again for joining me. And special thank you to all my Patreon subscribers whose funds go towards supporting the costs involved with running this podcast and bringing it to you effectively free of charge. So thank you truly to all those members who have come on board. And there is other stuff on Patreon that's not really posted anywhere else, the odd blog post and things every now and then, and other little bits and bobs. So go check that out. You can join for free, or you can definitely subscribe and help support the podcast that's supporting you. We are having a bumper wet season so far. I don't know, actually couldn't tell you whether the rainfalls are above average or what, but it's definitely been pretty consistent. We've got a bit of a tropical low here. We're expecting 200 mils of rain, then it didn't really happen. Still got some reasonable rain, but still got some lows hanging about. And towards the end of the week, still a potential of cyclonic activity forming out to the west of the NT and then heading back eastbound. So I don't know. See what happens. We've already had one this year. See if we're going to get another one. But lots of water around. All the floodplains are wet. Communities cut off, and GA is going strong at the moment, supporting all those communities. I'm sure you've seen in the news the last few days that a accident occurred in about 2017 during flight training in a Foxbat at Bendigo, and the student was being assessed and doing a solo send, and at some point their directional control on the ground deteriorated. The instructor intervened on the controls, but apparently did not make it clear that they had control. The student hadn't fully relinquished control. Both pilots ended up pushing right rudder simultaneously, and the aircraft departed the runway environment. The aircraft then became airborne by the student, possible through a bit of panic of seeing the edge of the runway coming up, so they tried to leap the aircraft into the ground, stalled and crashed. So what happened? Well, I'm not the ATSB. The ATSB report is out there, and it's not actually the bit I want to talk about. There's one element of it, but again, as always, I want to make it very clear. I have not spoken to the student. I've not spoken to the instructor. I've not spoken to the investigators, but I'm merely going to use this accident as a discussion piece and potentially a wake-up call, I guess, for some operators to just really think about what they're doing, and let's not make this a regular occurrence. Now, the key error in this accident was not necessarily a lack of skill, but a lack of clarity. And it's a problem instructors can have very easily and subconsciously, where they may try to assist a student rather than assert authority as far as a clear control environment as to who is flying the aeroplane. And in this case, effectively created a dual input conflict. It left the student believing that they still had control or some form of control. So 2 pilots, 1 aeroplane, and very little clarity at all, which is a recipe for disaster. And definitely a topic that I have raised multiple times, that, 2 qualified pilots being in an aeroplane is potentially very dangerous and one of the worst situations not one of the worst situations, but there's high risk where one thinks the other's doing the right thing, and out of mutual respect or assuming that one has more of the lead than the other, rather than playing the roles. That if you are PIC, then that's what you do, and you're the other pilot. So let's just have a bit of a look at what happened here. And again, it's feeding into the theme of the last few weeks with startle and surprise, of course, but also adding in some cognitive overload, all right, or just inability to think. So from a human factors perspective, the student is a student, right? So they're in the early phases of the career. They're effectively at the mercy of their instructor to help them and guide them through and teach. They're still very, very early on. So they're already under pressure. From whatever happened at this solo phase, the instructor's partial intervention added confusion and no real clear transfer of responsibility as to who was flying the aeroplane happened. And this can be a classic startle effect. It can be an example of authority ambiguity and an expectation mismatch of what one person's expecting to happen versus the reality of what does happen. And this is a case not just for student pilots, but for student pilots further on in their training through PPL level, CPL level, but also for pilots sharing an aeroplane together. And I know a good friend of mine who was flying an aeroplane on behalf of the owner, and they got themselves in a little bit of strife. The owner assisted, but never fully took over. But again, the pilot helping assumed that, well, they've taken over now, and they're in a bit more of a dual environment in recent times. So they're just kind of like, right, handing over, even though no words took place. Once the aircraft was under control, the owner supposedly relinquished control back to the pilot, who was not flying the aeroplane, and the aircraft crashed. So this has happened multiple times. I had a bit of a look through the ADSB website, and there are some cases as helicopter, very similar thing, where there was confusion as to who was actually flying the aeroplane to avoid the accident. So it's not an uncommon problem, and obviously there's a lot of threat and error management and MCC and crew resource management training and programs to help avoid these very incidents and SOPs and the like. So what we need to make sure we avoid the scenario of is the student thinks I'm still flying, the instructor thinks I'm just helping, but at the end of the day, the airplane doesn't care. It needs someone to be behind the controls. So there's only real two safe states in flight instruction. Either the student has control or the instructor has control. Everything else is a trap for the disaster. Right? But instructors can routinely fall into I'll just add a little bit of elevator or rudder, or I'll steady it a little bit, or I don't want to overload them. But the reality is the student doesn't know if you've taken over or not. And their brain either will or won't relinquish authority fully. And now you have two pilots either commanding or not commanding one aircraft. And that's not teaching, that's confusion. And there are definitely times where we want to demonstrate something or guide or help. They're over controlling or not quite getting the attitude right, and we just need to stop them pulling up or easing forward or something like that. Right? But this is where we get into that dangerous middle ground. Right? This dangerous grey zone of not fully hands off, but not fully in command. Now, some may argue, well, the instructor never said, I have control, in which case the student should not have thought otherwise. But at the same time, when a senior pilot takes control, they may deem that as them taking control because they're the instructor. That's what they do. And so it could go either way, depending on the confidence of the student and how, strictly speaking, they're following the SOPs or the procedure. Sometimes we might, assist without verbalizing control. Sometimes we might just use verbal commands and not actually put hands on the controls at all. All right, but that grey zone can kill clarity. So we must be very, very clear that you might, as an instructor, say, you have control, but I'm going to follow through and assist you on this one, just to make sure that they understand what's happening. Again, clear, concise communication. And this is specifically why procedures and SOPs exist, right? Professional organizations, flight schools, check and training organizations, multi-crew operations will be very clear on a handing over, taking over, I have control, you have control process. And something we drill into instructors and instructor training, that if they have not done an effective handover, takeover, then you don't let go of the controls until they read it back to you. And every instructor should be making sure that's happening. It's a big thing on the test form. So on the NTS skills as well, that if your student doesn't read back, I have control or whatever, then you do not give back control. And if you want it, they must read back, you have control, or handing over, whatever your process is. And that will, again, help drill those processes in early in their flying careers. So there's positive confirmation, no ambiguity. All right. Now, why is this so important? Because in high workload moments, pilots will revert back to their training, their core training. They don't negotiate control, they react. All right. So procedures aren't there because we don't trust instructors or anything. They're just there because, stressful environments can destroy assumptions. And we want to make sure that we definitely know who is flying the aeroplane here. So what was the legal exposure in this case? Well, it went before the courts. Now, this is potentially an example of a flight school that feels that it operates under the rules and laws of CASA. But as with any business, as with any organization, CASA is the regulatory authority that sets the rules and the guidelines, but we still have all other Commonwealth and federal and state laws, fair work laws. We talked about all this sort of stuff at the RAAA conference in Hobart, where it's not necessarily something we're all very familiar with. Now, in this case, the court made it clear that once an instructor intervened physically, responsibility shifts. Partial control without verbal command can lead to or be read as negligence, and the instructor created a conflict, not the student. So this is the critical part of all this, that you cannot kind of take control legally, operationally, and ethically. So with regards to duty of care, the Victorian Supreme Court found that the accident was reasonably foreseeable. A clear control handover would have likely prevented it, and the instructor created the conflict. Therefore, the training organisation was liable. As a result of the accident, the students suffered psychological trauma. They had loss of career, their pathway, they couldn't return to flying, and a permanent inability to pursue that career. So a loss of income, which is what the payout was about. Now, this is really, really important because the court did not accept I was just helping as a defence. The appeal was thrown out unanimously, and it basically said that once you're touching the controls, you have now assumed responsibility, you've assumed authority, and you've assumed liability. So this is pretty serious. And this is something for instructors and flight schools and check-in trainers to really understand. All right, so the student wasn't permanently physically injured, but yeah, like I said, did suffer that psychological trauma and loss of future potential earning capacity, and the court accepted that. So the real huge shift here that instructors need to understand is you don't need a broken aeroplane or broken bones to be legally exposed. So what does this mean for instructors and operators? Well, for instructors, you need to ask yourself honestly, do you always verbalize effective control transfer? Do you ever assist without any mention of it or without any command? And do you model this discipline consistently for students? Again, like I was saying before, to ensure that both of you are following this process and ingraining it in their day-to-day flying. Because students fly how we teach, not necessarily how we intend for them to fly. So we must be demonstrating by example. Now, for training organisations, this case really screams SOP enforcement. Don't just have it in your manual. It's not enough to have procedures. You've got to live them. All right. So SOP enforcement, instructor standardisation. So on S&P checks, which are required annually, on FPCs and any other check flights or upgrades and stuff that happen in between, any back seats, observation flights, to be ensuring that instructors are doing these processes and procedures properly. Obviously, part of our NTSCM factors, recurrent training that's required, and living by example. All right, so what about indemnity? And the common belief, is that most instructors, flight schools, operators believe that, they've signed a terms and conditions of hire, they've signed a waiver, they've acknowledged that there's an inherent risk in flying and aviation, and they've indemnified us. We're okay, we're in the clear. But what you need to understand is indemnities do not protect you from negligence. Now, before I go any further on this bit, I just want to make it very clear that I am not a lawyer. I'm not an aviation lawyer. I'm not a legal lawyer. This is what I know and understand from years of operating in organizations and businesses and researching. But I would strongly suggest that anyone has any concerns that they do get their own independent legal advice to ensure that they have the relevant protections in place. But these are the things that you need to consider and think about and be aware of. And from the few indemnities that I found online, where some of them are potentially insufficient or leaving themselves still open. So indemnities under Australian law, you effectively cannot contract out of a duty of care. You can't waive negligence. You can't excuse inadequate training, poor training, unsafe instruction. All right. So even if you were to put, even if we're negligent, that doesn't cut it. All right. So indemnity can cover things like inherent risk. So saying that, hey, if you were to hurt yourself, if we were to hit some weather or bad turbulence, have a mechanical failure or something like that, known aviation hazards, there may be some levels of protection, but it does not cover poor instruction, failure to adhere to CASA regulations or SOP breaches, ops manual exposition breaches, instructional errors, or failure to exercise reasonable care, which is what this is all about. And this case pretty much sort of confirms that viewpoint. All right, so the instructor takeaway bit is paperwork doesn't override professionalism. All right. If you touch the controls, you fail to communicate, you create a level of ambiguity in the cockpit, that indemnity form, that waiver, anything else, that form's not going to save you. And it's not going to save the organisation. Now, this is not a weekly or yearly thing, right? So we don't need to be scared and nervous and worried, but where instructors and flight schools, check-in trainers, operators should be taking note of this accident and the outcome is, it's not that it's necessarily been unfair, but it's been a predictable situation. We know about command and control and how students can be uncertain as to who's doing what, potentially default, like I said, to the instructor because they're the senior pilot on board and they should know what's going on. But we need to be very, very careful that it's not an environment we do not create. All right, so the risk is not necessarily the flying or the students or the weather. It's The risk is developing informal habits, sloppy command discipline, and ultimately normalized deviations. That's really where this becomes common practice and routine, assuming that it's not going to affect us or be an issue anymore, and that's when things can really bite. So every time as instructors we just help a bit, or we skip the words, or we assume the student knows, we're just stacking up on a legal safety risk there. All right, so what good instruction looks like? Good instruction is not gentle, it's clear. All right, so good early intervention, decisive control, calm authority, verbalized handovers, no egos, no hesitation, following the MOS, Schedule 8, the tolerances, upholding the standard that we're looking for. And just remember that students need firm guidance. They don't need a best friend. They don't need instructors who are nice. They need instructors who are clear. And as I've always said, that doesn't turn us into an asshole or anything else, but 100% some of the flying that I've been doing recently over the last few months is definitely showing that instructors have been kind, have been helping, and it's not helping the students at all. It might be helping in the terms of being a nice person, but you're not helping the objectives of what you're trying to teach your students at the end of the day, and that is to be solid, rounded, competent pilots when they're out on their own and able to deal with things. All right, so remember this case and this podcast, it's not about blame. I don't judge anybody. We're human. Thankfully, nobody died in this particular accident, although, harm was still done. Right, but it's not about blame, it's about discipline. This wasn't a reckless student, wasn't an engine failure or bad weather or running out of fuel. It was a well-intentioned instructor trying to help. But in doing so, they removed the one thing aviation demands in moments of stress, and that is clarity. Right, so remember, discipline and communication, discipline and authority, discipline and understanding. Right, that helping isn't neutral. And if you're relying on indemnity instead of good instruction, you're going to be already exposed. Right, so remember, fly safe, teach properly, don't blur the line between assistance and command. Alrighty, so hopefully that gives you some pointers and things to consider, and just to review what you're doing as an individual and as an organisation. All right, that is it for this week's episode. Thank you very much again for listening. Please keep all your comments coming. A few of you have been leaving comments on Spotify. Thank you so much. That means the world to me. You can also do the same on Apple Podcasts, and I definitely can read those and reply to the Spotify ones now anyway. I'm going to be doing some interviews very soon, and I am also organising a few little trips and visits, which I'll hopefully be able to talk about in the next week or two. In the meantime, please stay safe, enjoy your flying, enjoy aviation, and remember the golden rule: aviate, navigate, communicate. Cheers, everyone.